You probably know there are different types of drywall, right? You likely know that there's a drywall that can be used on non-rated walls and a different drywall that you need on fire-rated walls. You probably even know that the drywall used on fire-rated walls is called Type X. But do you know the difference between the standard non-rated drywall and the Type X drywall? And do you know that there's another type of drywall called Type C drywall? If you deal with drywall, specifying, installing, or inspecting, then this Firestop Coffee Break training has a lot of valuable information for you. And I'm glad you're here. It will help you understand why regular drywall and Type X are not interchangeable. Then we'll tackle the difference between Type X and Type C drywall in our next video. If you haven't seen any of my videos before, you may not know me. My name is Sharon, and I'm with Halpert Life Safety Consulting. Before I worked in construction, I used to teach kindergarten. I loved it. My enthusiasm came out in almost every class. Well, guess what? I really love what I do now, even more. And I deal in fire stop and passive fire protection. You can imagine in kindergarten, I would tell a lot of stories and I would ask the kids to use their imagination, right? Well, that hasn't changed very much. I tend to pepper my fire stop training with lots of stories. Otherwise, talking about building codes and fire test standards, it's gonna get a little bit boring. So my goal with these videos is to animate the boring bits and help you apply the information to your job. Sound good? So about these stories, I should tell you that some of them are real, some of them are stretched a little bit, and some are completely fabricated. But the stories are intended to help you see how the codes and standards apply to what you do in the field. It doesn't matter if you design the building, build it, inspect it, or maintain it. This video series is designed to help you understand passive fire protection so that you can build better. Doing that reduces the liability for your company, your clients, and the community that you're working in. These videos build on information that we presented in earlier videos. So if you're watching this one, I assume that you already understand how fire-rated assemblies are tested. If that's true, you'll be up to speed on this video. If it's not, please watch the other videos in this series about fire-rated test standards, specifically the one on ASTM E119, which is the fire test that we're referring to, and make sure that you know about the T ratings and the hose stream tests, because we're going to assume that you know the basics of both of these elements of the test standards. But there is one more test standard that I'll give you a quick explanation of, and that's ASTM E136. This is the standard test method for the behavior of materials in a vertical tube furnace at 750 degrees Celsius. So that's the formal name for the test, and it's used for a few different reasons. One of those is to determine if something can be considered non-combustible. When you understand a few of the basics on how this test is run, it'll help you understand why the difference between these two types of drywall are so important. Now, we aren't going to get into the specifics of the detail about this test standard. If you want that, please go to the ASTM website, buy the standard, and read up on it. I just want you to understand one element of it. So very, very generally, the one element of this test standard is that they take a sample of the material that's going to be tested. They weigh it, and then they burn it. Well, they don't really burn it, but to get into that is to dig into more specifics than you really need for this story. So let's keep it simple and say that they weigh it, then they kind of burn it, and then they weigh it again. They want to see how much mass the test sample has lost, because that mass turns into fuel for the fire. You remember Einstein's E equals mc squared, so you already know that there's a correlation between mass and energy, right? So let's explain this another way. When you heat something up and it gives off energy, then the mass or the weight will change. If it gives off energy, then it's adding fuel to the fire. Think about the last time you sat around a campfire. The piece of wood that you put on the fire may have been heavy initially, but when it's done burning, the ashes are light enough that it can be blown away in the wind. So ASTM E136 looks at the weight of the product, the energy that it releases. When the Type X drywall is tested, it doesn't put off enough energy. It doesn't lose enough weight, so it's considered non-combustible. That's a very general way that this test is conducted. Let's look at concrete, for example. If you subject it to the temperatures that you could expect in a typical fire scenario, the mass isn't going to change much. Concrete is endothermic. That means that it has chemically bound water that it can release, which helps make it more resilient in a fire because it absorbs the heat as it releases the water. So the energy goes into that chemical reaction that's releasing the water and not into consuming the concrete the way that it consumes wood. Drywall is endothermic as well. This is the chemical formula. Can you believe it's actually 50% water? Now that you understand the fire dynamics between energy and mass, let's talk about how it relates to our drywall. Today we're going to talk about regular drywall and Type X drywall and how they're different. So first, let's talk about drywall in general. When you look at it, it's pretty basic, right? It's paper sandwiching gypsum compound. Drywall. It comes in different thicknesses depending on what you want to do with it, but there are two things that make standard drywall different from Type X drywall. One is the density of the drywall. That greater density found in the Type X drywall means that it will have a greater mass, and that means that it will survive the fire better than the typical drywall. It'll need more energy to consume it than the drywall with the lighter mass. The second thing that makes Type X drywall different is that it has fibers. There are these glass fibers. They look like little whiskers. They add strength to the drywall. If you score the drywall and snap it, these little things stick out. They're critical to why the Type X drywall can survive the ASTM E119 test. Now, let's bring this all together and talk about it in relation to the fire test. Remember, during the ASTM E119 test, we can't let fire through, we can't let heat through, and we also have to be able to survive the hose stream test. I asked a few different drywall manufacturers, how long would a wall last if they tested non-rated drywall to ASTM E119? And the general answer is that a typical wall without the Type X drywall would likely fail around 15 or 20 minutes. But why? We didn't even have a chance to get to the hose stream test. To understand why, let's talk about how the difference in the density will impact our Type X drywall. Remember our campfire and that big piece of wood that you put on? Remember how dramatically different it looked in the morning? It was just a pile of ash. Well, as it burned, it lost mass. As our drywall burns, it will lose mass too, and as that happens, cracks will form. Okay, so stop for a minute. I want you to picture a puzzle. Think about all the pieces and how they seat one into the next and into the next. The individual puzzle pieces coming together until you have a whole sheet of drywall. It would look like this. Now, during a fire, each puzzle piece in that sheet will lose mass. And what's happening? It's losing water. As that happens, each individual piece will get smaller, and as the pieces shrink, the gaps between the puzzles get wider and wider until eventually the wall loses its structural integrity and the fire can come through. But before that, the heat will come through and you'll fail just on the thermal transfer hitting those critical temperatures that we talked about before. So I hope that puzzle analogy gives you an image of how the standard drywall would perform in a fire test. Now, let's talk about how the Type X drywall is different. Our Type X drywall will perform better for a few reasons. One is the increased density. That means you need more energy before those gaps in the puzzle piece start to happen. They'll still happen, but that's why the fibers are so critical in our Type X drywall. Let's stop for a minute and change gears. Just for a second, I want you to think about concrete. Your concrete floor is not going to be just concrete, is it? What else is in there? Rebar, right? Why do we have rebar in our concrete? What happens to our concrete as it cures? It's going to crack, right? But that's okay because we expect the concrete to crack. That's why we have the rebar in the concrete. The rebar helps hold everything together even with the cracks. Without rebar, the concrete has very little structural integrity. Well, that same sort of thing happens with the fibers in our Type X drywall. I want you to think of the fibers as rebar. As the gaps between our puzzle pieces grow because our drywall is losing mass, the fibers act like rebar and hold it all together. So a wall made with Type X drywall, the wall with the rebar, will be able to survive the hose stream test. Let's recap. So the difference between our regular drywall and our Type X drywall, two primary things. One is the increased density, and the other is the rebar, or the fiber reinforcement. Clearly, the two products are not interchangeable. You probably already knew that, but now you also know why. And now you have this image of puzzles and rebar. See what happens when a kindergarten teacher talks fire test standards? So that brings us to the end of this Fire Stop Coffee Break training. But before I go, I want to ask you a question. If you have a horizontal rated gypsum assembly, like a rated ceiling or a whole floor ceiling assembly, are you using Type X drywall? If you are, then I'd like to invite you to watch the next video in our series. We'll talk about the difference between Type X drywall and Type C drywall. Now that you understand the difference between regular drywall and Type X drywall, you may need to know the difference between Type X and Type C, especially if you're installing it in a horizontal application. I'll give you a hint. It's the same puzzle pieces with some extra rebar, and we'll throw in some popcorn. Well, it's not really popcorn, it's vermiculite, but telling the story is so much more fun with puzzles and rebar and popcorn. So, as always, I want to say thank you for your time today. I know you wouldn't be here with me if you didn't want to do things right, and I appreciate that. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, share, and comment on your favorite social media platforms, and tell people about these classes so we can help other people build better. If you have ideas for other topics you want me to cover, just let me know. So I'll sign off for now, and I'll see you on your next coffee break. You gonna bring the popcorn?